Listen closely to the sound of raw turpentine and aged beeswax as it warms against the grain of mahogany. If you close your eyes, right here in the freezing heart of the Colorado Rockies, you can almost hear the steady, rhythmic scrape of a metal blade against a century of peeling paint. That sound has been my life for over 40 years. My name is Eleanor Vance, and I am 65 years old. Down here in the damp, quiet shadows of the subterranean restoration workshop beneath the grand arches of the Aspen Ridge estate, the air always smells of linseed oil, mineral spirits, and history. This sprawling, world-class ecological sanctuary spans 650 acres of pristine mountain wilderness. It boasts 58 secluded pine chalets, 3 Michelin-starred dining pavilions, and an award-winning championship golf course that cuts through the sweeping alpine valleys. Independent financial auditing firms currently value this sprawling empire at a staggering $128 million. Yet, if you were to look up the official corporate registry or scan the internal weekly payroll ledger of the resort, my name does not appear among the board of directors, the principal stakeholders, or even the administration. I am officially logged down as maintenance technical staff, employee number 4, earning a modest hourly minimum wage that barely covers the cost of my modest groceries in the nearby town. I leaned closer to the antique Victorian armchair resting on my wooden workbench, my knuckles stained permanently dark with walnut stain and dark varnish. With meticulous patience, I used a narrow steel spatula to lift a microscopic curl of flaking lacquer from the carved wooden armrest. This exact chair was purchased back in the harsh winter of 1978 by my late husband Arthur Vance, using every single penny of his meager savings from working the local copper mines. Back then, there were no paved roads leading up this mountain, no luxury sport utility vehicles idling by the porte-cochere, and no glass-fronted suites overlooking the snow-capped peaks. There was only raw wind, heavy timber, a young couple with dreams of carving out a legacy for their children, and blistered hands that refused to bleed in vain. Arthur and I built the foundations of this very lodge with our own raw sweat, hauling logs through freezing blizzards before modern machinery ever touched the soil. But memories, as I have painfully learned, do not carry legal weight when corporate sharks begin circling the waters. The heavy iron door of the basement workshop groaned open, breaking the silence of my sanctuary. Footsteps echoed sharply against the concrete floor, the crisp, expensive sound of Italian leather soles that had never known a day of genuine physical labor. My eldest son, Derek Vance, walked into the dim light. At 38 years old, Derek occupies the high-backed leather chair upstairs as the chief operating officer of the entire resort, wrapped in custom-tailored wool suits and smelling faintly of imported cologne. Right behind him stood Garrett Puett, the 45-year-old external chief executive officer whom Derek had brought in 3 years ago to modernize corporate operations, and who conveniently happens to be Derek's prospective father-in-law. Garrett carried himself with the slick, predatory posture of a Wall Street vulture who viewed human relationships merely as assets on a balance sheet. Derek didn't bother looking around the workshop or acknowledging the museum-grade restoration pieces surrounding us. With a sharp, dismissive flick of his wrist, he tossed a heavy, gold-embossed invitation straight across my workbench. It slid over the sandpaper and wood shavings, coming to a halt directly on top of the antique upholstery I was repairing. The thick cardstock was heavy, imported, and reeked of elite pretension. Embossed in glittering metallic gold leaf across the front was an announcement for the Grand Executive Gala celebrating Derek's official coronation as the president and controlling chairman of the board. My eyes drifted downward to the bottom margin, where a fine print subtext explicitly designated seating arrangements for the lower-tier staff. Staff member Eleanor Vance, woodshop maintenance crew. access restricted exclusively to the rear service corridors and catering staging areas. Garrett Pruitt stepped forward, his lips curling into a thin, patronizing smile that didn't reach his cold, calculating eyes. He leaned against the edge of my workbench, casually brushing a speck of sawdust off his immaculate sleeve, as if even the dust offended him. "Make sure you wear something clean and presentable this Friday night, Eleanor. We'll have high-profile investors flying in directly from Manhattan, and we certainly don't need anyone mistaking our maintenance staff for part of the family." Derek stood beside him in absolute silence, offering neither a word of defense nor a flicker of protest against the open humiliation of his own mother. He simply looked away, adjusting his gold-plated wristwatch, fully complicit in the quiet erasure of my existence within the very empire I had bled to build. I did not raise my voice. I did not let my hands tremble, nor did I grant them the satisfaction of a single tear. With absolute, unhurried calm, I picked up the golden invitation, reached into the small drawer beneath my workbench, and pulled out a damp rag soaked in turpentine. Slowly, deliberately, I wiped away a smudge of wood glue that had accidentally smeared across the corner of the card. Then, without a single glance up at their faces, I placed the invitation neatly upright on the wooden bookshelf, right beside the faded, framed portrait of my late husband Arthur, whose steady eyes seemed to watch the entire scene unfold with a sorrowful, prophetic wisdom. The heavy scent of pine and burning juniper lingered in the dusk as I locked up the restoration workshop, my boots crunching against the frosty gravel paths of Aspen Ridge. Even after 40 years, I still walked the outer perimeter every single evening, checking the copper-jacketed pipes of the central boiler room that fed warmth into every chalet on the mountain. It was a ritual I had started alongside Arthur, a quiet way of keeping my hands on the pulse of this land. But tonight, the pulse felt erratic, poisoned from within. Passing beneath the heavy second-floor balcony of the main administration lodge, I noticed the heavy velvet drapes of the executive boardroom were left half-drawn. A strip of harsh fluorescent light sliced across the dark patio. Through the reinforced glass, I saw them. Derek sat at the head of the polished oak table, his fingers nervously tapping against a stack of crisp legal folios. Across from him sat Garrett Pruitt, leaning forward with the easy, practiced posture of a man who already owned the room, flanked by two sharp-suited corporate attorneys from Meridian Capital Group. I stepped into the shadows of the stone pillar, hidden from view, and watched the silent pantomime of greed unfold through the glass. Garrett was pushing a thick document across the mahogany table toward my son, his pen poised like a surgeon's scalpel. The numbers they bandied about were staggering, cold executions of assets built on decades of back-breaking labor. Garrett was systematically coercing Derek into signing a fraudulent emergency corporate restructuring agreement. Under the pretext of maximizing institutional liquidity and streamlining post-merger operations, they were deliberately slashing the official book value of the entire $128 million Aspen Ridge estate down to a meager $14.5 million on paper. The plan was to execute a rapid hostile buyout with Meridian Capital, pushing a one-time cash payout of $3.2 million directly into Derek's personal accounts, leaving the rest buried under layers of complex offshore shell companies controlled entirely by Garrett. Through the faint soundproofing of the glass, I watched Derek hesitate, his brow furrowing as he muttered something, likely mentioning me, or perhaps my youngest daughter Nora, who was living an honest life working as a high school literature teacher down in Denver. But Garrett didn't miss a beat. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping into that smooth, venomous cadence of psychological manipulation that had steadily unraveled my son's moral compass over the past 3 years. "Your mother is an old ghost living in the past, Derek. If we don't cut her loose before the institutional funds lock in their audits, we lose everything to state probate and redundant legacy clauses." The words hung in my mind, sharp as icicles. I didn't storm into the room. I didn't bang on the glass or demand an explanation. I turned away into the freezing mountain night, my breath pluming white in the dark, carrying the heavy weight of a truth I had tried too long to ignore. For decades, I had believed that shielding my children from the harsh realities of business, poverty, and sacrifice was the ultimate expression of maternal love. I had stayed silent, working in the dirt and the wood smoke, letting them wear the titles while I held the foundation. But tonight, standing under the freezing stars, I realized my silence had not protected them. It had only given their greed a safe harbor to grow into a monster. Hours later, long after the boardroom lights had flickered out and the resort had grown deathly still, I sat alone in the subterranean dark of my workshop. The only illumination came from a single, green-shaded brass desk lamp. Kneeling beside the heavy iron workbench, I reached underneath the floorboards and unlocked the rusted steel combination safe that had remained untouched since the day my husband died, 25 years to the date. From inside, I pulled out a thick manila envelope, its edges yellowed and brittle with age, sealed with a red wax stamp bearing the initials of Arthur Vance. Inside lay a single sheet of lined notebook paper, covered in my late husband's familiar, hurried handwriting, penned during his final painful weeks in the hospital. I read the words for the 1,000th time, their meaning heavier now than ever. Eleanor, you can shelter them from poverty, but never shelter them from the truth. Your silence will become the very blade that pierces your heart when greed finally wakes up. I did not weep. Grief was a luxury I had traded away long ago for survival and duty. With steady, unhurried fingers, I set aside Arthur's letter and drew out another document, the pristine, legally binding master original of the irrevocable family trust, registered under Delaware state jurisdiction back in the autumn of 1999, bearing the exact filing number TX8821. I turned past the introductory clauses directly to Section 12, Paragraph 4, where the foundational covenants were laid down in unyielding ink. Any sitting director, shareholder, or operational officer who attempts to fraudulently alienate, devalue, or transfer estate assets below fair market value without unanimous board consent shall immediately forfeit all distributed shares, lose all fiduciary privileges, and trigger an automatic reversion of 100% proprietary control back to the sole surviving founder and grantor, Eleanor Vance. I picked up my old wooden fountain pen, filled with dark iron gal ink, and traced my thumb over the signature line. The trap was set. The silence was about to break. By 6 o'clock on Friday evening, the Grand Crystal Hall was a blinding cascade of Italian crystal chandeliers and polished marble. More than 120 high-profile investors, local municipal officials, and media executives mingled beneath the soaring timber arches, their crystal champagne flutes clinking softly as they toasted Derek Vance's monumental corporate achievement. Heavy orchestral music drifted through the vaulted ceilings, setting a tone of elite triumph. The air smelled of expensive French perfume, roasted venison, and old money, masking the lingering scent of snow and pine drifting in from the outside valley. I did not enter through the grand double doors under the custom wrought iron portico, nor did I walk the red carpet rolled out for the VIPs. I used the heavy, utilitarian metal service door tucked away behind the catering staging area, flanked by rolling utility carts, stainless steel racks of glassware, and stacked crates of imported wine. I wore the same simple, well-worn linen shirt I had worn all week at the workbench. My sleeves were rolled up, and if you looked closely at my wrists, you could still spot faint traces of dark walnut stain and crushed walnut husk embedded deep in the skin, the honest, indelible marks of an afternoon spent restoring a 19th-century rosewood writing desk. I hadn't dressed down to make a statement or to beg for sympathy. I simply came as I was, a woodworker who had just laid down her tools for the evening. I slipped quietly into the very last row of folding chairs near the back service exit, blending into the heavy shadows beneath the balcony overhang. Up on the elevated mahogany stage, bathed in warm amber spotlights, Derek stood beside a towering ice sculpture carved into the immaculate shape of the Aspen Ridge logo. He wore a midnight blue tuxedo, cut by a master tailor in Milan, his hair freshly styled, radiating the polished confidence of a man who believed he had conquered the mountain entirely on his own terms. He looked every inch the corporate king. When Derek stepped up to the brass podium to deliver his keynote acceptance speech, the polite applause swelled and rolled across the ballroom like a wave. I watched him adjust the microphone, expecting, perhaps foolishly, for a fleeting, desperate second, that a son might look back across the decades and utter a quiet word of gratitude to the hands that built the ground beneath his feet. Instead, Derek smiled, scanned the sea of wealthy faces, and deliberately raised his voice, sweeping a hand out toward the rear of the hall where I sat in the dark. Ladies and gentlemen, our success today is built not only on modern strategy, but on the quiet, cheap labor of those who know their place, Derek said, his voice echoing cleanly through the state-of-the-art surround sound speakers. My mother, Eleanor, a loyal maintenance worker who has spent her entire life surrounded by sawdust and basement corners, is here tonight to witness her son lead Aspen Ridge into a multi-hundred-million-dollar future far beyond the outdated limits of the past. A collective, jagged murmur rippled through the crowd of investors, a few polite, uncomfortable chuckles escaping lips holding champagne glasses as their heads turned back to look at the lone woman sitting in work clothes near the service exit. Their eyes scanned my unadorned clothing with a mixture of casual dismissal, amusement, and mild curiosity, treating me like an exhibit in a museum of low-class origins. Before the echo of Derek's public humiliation had even faded across the vaulted timber ceiling, Garrett Pute stepped up beside him on the stage. Garrett did not smile. His expression was cold, calculating, and absolute. He snapped open a thick, heavy leather legal binder embossed with corporate seals, extracted a single crisp paper, and walked deliberately down the steps toward the back of the hall. His Italian leather shoes clicked sharply against the polished marble floor, each step a hammer blow against the silence. He stopped just 3 feet from where I sat, towering over my folding chair. He held the document out, his voice sharp and loud enough to cut through the muted background music. Eleanor Vance, to finalize the legal transfer procedures for Meridian Corporation, you are hereby requested to sign this document relinquishing all residential rights and property claims concerning plot number 4 immediately. In return, management will provide you with a modest retirement allowance of $1,200 per month so you may live out the remainder of your days in a modest suburban communal apartment. The entire grand ballroom plunged into a sudden, suffocating silence. The ambient chatter died instantly, leaving only the faint mechanical hum of the overhead air conditioning vents. A few prominent investors nearest us froze, their crystal glasses suspended mid-air, while others stared in visible shock at the outright public cruelty unfolding before them, casting glances of profound pity, disbelief, and quiet disgust toward my seat. They had come to celebrate a corporate merger, not a public execution of maternal dignity. I sat entirely still, my hands resting calmly and deliberately folded in my lap, feeling the heavy gaze of 100 strangers burning hot into my skin. I did not flinch, I did not lower my head, and I did not let a single muscle twitch. I simply looked up at the legal document fluttering slightly in Garrett's outstretched hand, knowing with absolute clarity that the trap was fully sprung and waiting patiently for the final, irreversible act to begin. By 6 o'clock on Friday evening, The grand crystal hall was a blinding cascade of Italian crystal chandeliers and polished marble. More than 120 high-profile investors, local municipal officials, and media executives mingled beneath the soaring timber arches, their crystal champagne flutes clinking softly as they toasted Derek Vance's monumental corporate achievement. Heavy orchestral music drifted through the vaulted ceilings, setting a tone of elite triumph. The air smelled of expensive French perfume, roasted venison, and old money, masking the lingering scent of snow and pine drifting in from the outside valley air. I did not enter through the grand double doors under the custom wrought iron portico, nor did I walk the red carpet rolled out for the VIPs. I used the heavy, utilitarian metal service door tucked away behind the catering staging area, flanked by rolling utility carts, stainless steel racks of glassware, and stacked crates of imported wine. I wore the same simple, well-worn linen shirt I had worn all week at the workbench. My sleeves were rolled up, and if you looked closely at my wrists, you could still spot faint traces of dark walnut stain and crushed walnut husk embedded deep in the skin. The honest, indelible marks of an afternoon spent restoring a 19th century rosewood writing desk. I hadn't dressed down to make a statement or to beg for sympathy. I simply came as I was, a woodworker who had just laid down her tools for the evening, stepping quietly out of the shadows of the estate to witness what my son had truly become. I slipped unobserved into the very last row of folding chairs near the back service exit, blending into the heavy shadows beneath the balcony overhang. Up on the elevated mahogany stage, bathed in warm amber spotlights, Derek stood beside a towering ice sculpture carved into the immaculate shape of the Aspen Ridge logo. He wore a midnight blue tuxedo cut by a master tailor in Milan, his hair freshly styled, radiating the polished confidence of a man who believed he had conquered the mountain entirely on his own terms. He looked every inch the corporate king, basking in the applause of men who only cared about margins and dividends, utterly blind to the foundation beneath his feet. When Derek stepped up to the brass podium to deliver his keynote acceptance speech, the polite applause swelled and rolled across the ballroom like a wave. I watched him adjust the microphone, expecting, perhaps foolishly, for a fleeting, desperate second that a son might look back across the decades and utter a quiet word of gratitude to the hands that built the ground beneath his feet. Instead, Derek smiled, scanned the sea of wealthy faces, and deliberately raised his voice, sweeping a hand out toward the rear of the hall where I sat in the dark. Ladies and gentlemen, our success today is built not only on modern strategy, but on the quiet, cheap labor of those who know their place. My mother, Eleanor, a loyal maintenance worker who has spent her entire life surrounded by sawdust and basement corners, is here tonight to witness her son lead Aspen Ridge into a multi-hundred-million-dollar future, far beyond the outdated limits of the past. A collective, jagged murmur rippled through the crowd of investors, a few polite, uncomfortable chuckles escaping lips holding champagne glasses, as heads turned back to look at the lone woman sitting quietly in work clothes near the service exit. Their eyes scanned my unadorned clothing with a mixture of casual dismissal, amusement, and mild curiosity, treating me like an exhibit in a museum of low-class origins, a relic of the estate's humble beginnings meant to be cast aside. Before the echo of Derek's public humiliation had even faded across the vaulted timber ceiling, Garrett Puett stepped up beside him on the stage. Garrett did not smile. His expression was cold, calculating, and absolute. He snapped open a thick, heavy leather legal binder embossed with corporate seals, extracted a single crisp paper, and walked deliberately down the steps toward the back of the hall. His Italian leather shoes clicked sharply against the polished marble, each step a hammer blow against the muted silence. He stopped just 3 feet from where I sat, towering over my folding chair like an executioner. He held the document out, his voice sharp and loud enough to cut through the muted background music. Eleanor Vance, to finalize the legal transfer procedures for Meridian Corporation, you are hereby requested to sign this document relinquishing all residential rights and property claims concerning plot number 4 immediately. In return, management will provide you with a modest retirement allowance of $1,200 per month so you may live out the remainder of your days in a modest suburban communal apartment. The entire grand ballroom plunged into a sudden, suffocating silence. The ambient chatter died instantly, leaving only the faint mechanical hum of the overhead air conditioning vents. A few prominent investors nearest us froze, their crystal glasses suspended midair, while others stared in visible shock at the outright public cruelty unfolding before them, casting glances of profound pity, disbelief, and quiet disgust toward my seat. They had come to celebrate a corporate merger, not a public execution of maternal dignity. I sat entirely still, my hands resting calmly and deliberately folded in my lap, feeling the heavy gaze of 100 strangers burning hot into my skin. I did not flinch, I did not lower my head, and I did not let a single muscle twitch. I simply looked up at the legal document fluttering slightly in Garrett's outstretched hand, knowing with absolute clarity that the trap was fully sprung, and waiting patiently for the final irreversible act to begin under the blinding lights. The sirens did not shatter the heavy air of the grand crystal hull until Garrett Pewitt was already halfway to the service exit, his bespoke Italian leather shoes slipping frantically against the polished marble floor. 2 local police officers, summoned quietly by the digital security protocols tied to the estate's true land registry, moved through the shocked crowd with quiet, undeniable authority. There was no grand struggle, no cinematic wrestling match, just the cold, metallic click of handcuffs snapping around Garrett's wrists, cutting short his desperate attempts to shield his face from flashing media cameras. As the heavy oak doors swung shut behind Garrett, a collective panic swept through the room like wildfire. High-profile investors and municipal officials who had toasted Derek's triumph moments earlier suddenly realized they were standing knee-deep in fraudulent paper. Phones were whipped out from pockets and designer clutches, screen lights flickered across pale faces. Emergency merger clauses were torn to shreds, and multi-million-dollar commitments to Meridian Corporation were abruptly canceled right there on the ballroom floor. Within minutes, a multi-hundred-million-dollar corporate empire dissolved into an unmitigated disaster, leaving behind only the hollow echo of orchestral music playing from the ceiling speakers. Derek did not run. He could not. The polished confidence that had radiated from his custom Milanese tuxedo just minutes before vanished, leaving behind a hollowed-out shell of a man. As the last of the institutional investors turned their backs and walked out into the freezing valley night, Derek's legs simply gave out beneath him. He dropped hard onto the gleaming marble floor, his expensive knees crashing against the cold stone, his designer cuffs scraping uselessly against the surface. The man who thought he owned the mountain collapsed into a pathetic heap right beside the towering, melting ice sculpture of the Aspen Ridge logo. He didn't look at the empty room. Instead, he crawled frantically across the slick marble, his fingers clawing desperately at the fabric of my work trousers, his voice cracking into a ragged, pathetic sob. "Mother, please, I'm begging you, save me," Derek choked out, tears streaming down his face. "It was all Garrett. He pushed me into it. He tricked me into signing those papers. I didn't know. Please, you have to help your son." I did not flinch. I did not look down into his tear-soaked, terrified face. I stood completely still, feeling the weight of the moment settle over the silent, empty hall like fresh winter snow. Slowly, deliberately, I reached down and picked up the thick leather legal binder and the crisp papers containing the fraudulent transfer documents that Garrett had left discarded near my folding chair. The silence in the room grew even deeper, thick with a suffocating tension. Everyone was watching, waiting to see what a mother would do when her only child lay broken at her feet, begging for mercy. Instead of offering comfort, I reached slowly into the deep breast pocket of my well-worn linen work shirt. My fingers brushed against a piece of paper, not a corporate contract, but a fragile, yellowed fragment of lined notebook paper, frayed at the edges and creased into multiple squares from decades of folding. It was a relic from a different lifetime. I unfolded the paper with steady, unhurried fingers, letting the harsh amber spotlight catch the messy, childish handwriting scrawled in blue crayon. It was Derek's handwriting, penned 20 years ago when he was just 8 years old, back when he still spent his afternoons sitting on a wooden stool in the dusty basement workshop. The note, once carefully taped to the wall right above the old workbench, read, "When I grow up, I will help Mom and Dad keep this forest safe. I will never sell it to anyone." I held the scrap of paper in my hand, looking down at the childish promise, and then I began to read it out loud. My voice was low, devoid of emotion, just a steady, chilling cadence that carried across the cavernous timber arches. "When I grow up, I will help Mom and Dad keep this forest safe. I will never sell it to anyone." I recited the words, the heavy in the cold air. Derek froze, his chest heaving, his eyes wide with sudden terror as he stared up at the piece of paper from his childhood. I let the yellowed paper slip gracefully from my fingertips. It drifted slowly through the air before landing softly on the marble floor right in front of his trembling hands. "You traded the honor of the Vance family name, the ground beneath your feet, and the very memory of your father for $3.2 million tainted dollars. You thought you could buy your way out of the sawdust, Derek, but you forgot that sawdust is what holds the foundation together. Starting tomorrow morning, your new contract, Maintenance Laborer Number 4, officially begins. You will report to the service entrance at 5 o'clock sharp, equipped with a snow shovel, a heavy-duty broom, and a mortar trowel, exactly the same tools your parents used to build the ground you just tried to sell out from under us." Derek opened his mouth, a desperate gasp escaping his lips, but no words came out. He remained paralyzed, staring down at the crayon-written note of his 8-year-old self, as the reality of his eternal sentence sank deep into his bones. Without another word, without looking back even once, I turned my back on him, and I walked steadily down the long central aisle of the grand crystal hall, my heavy leather-soled boots clicking rhythmically against the stone. Behind me, the last of the overhead amber spotlights flickered and died, plunging the massive stage into absolute darkness. The corporate king of Aspen Ridge was left sitting alone in the freezing shadows of his own making, while I walked out into the quiet night, back to the honest work waiting for me in the shop. The night stretched on like a cold, eternal void. I was locked away in a small, weathered storage shed behind the old basement workshop, a place I once considered far too filthy and beneath me to ever set foot in. Gone was the custom-tailored Milanese tuxedo, the expensive gold-plated wristwatch, and the powerful corporate credit card capable of swaying an entire board of directors. My smartphone lay dead and silent on the rough wooden workbench, its screen dark after dozens of unanswered calls. I had called Garrett. The phone rang out endlessly before dropping to voicemail. I had called 5 of the most powerful institutional investment directors in Manhattan who had clapped me on the back just hours earlier. Some hung up on me instantly, while others dismissed me with a cold, single sentence. "I'm sorry, Derek. Our contract was terminated the moment you fell." The elite world I worshipped, a world built on cold, unfeeling numbers in a balance sheet, had discarded me faster than a crumpled piece of scrap paper. Utter isolation swallowed me whole inside that cramped room thick with the scent of turpentine and sawdust, exposing the humiliating emptiness within the soul of a man who thought he stood on top of the world. The faint click of a doorknob broke the suffocating silence, pulling me out of my panic. The door inched open and Nora stepped inside. My sister. She brought no triumphant gloating, no biting insults, and no sarcastic applause like the ones I had feared. Nora wore a simple knit sweater, carrying in her hands a weathered pine wood box, the very box our father used to keep his sharpest carving chisels. She set the box down onto the wooden table in front of me with a heavy thud, her eyes looking at me not with hatred, but with a profound, chilling disappointment. "What were you looking for up there on that peak, Derek? Dad left us a legacy forged in sweat and blood on this mountain, yet you chose to sell it out to men who only know how to view life through numbers on paper. You were terrified of poverty, terrified of being looked down on, but your own arrogance is what turned you into the most worthless creature in this entire valley." Nora flipped open the lid. Inside lay no money or corporate shares, but a single family photograph taken 30 years ago when I was just a dirt-smudged kid helping Dad haul pine logs, along with a set of worn-out woodworking tools. Nora said no more, turning silently on her heel and walking out, leaving me alone with the past I had desperately tried to bury. I buried my face in my hands, and for the first time in years, the first hot tears broke through my dry eyes, splashing down onto the rough grain of the wood. When the clock struck 5 in the morning, the biting, sub-zero winter cold of Colorado crept through every crack in the window, carrying swirling flurries of fresh morning snow. I stood before the mirror not to knot a silk tie or spray expensive cologne, but to shrug on a heavy, rigid, coarse canvas utility jacket, the standard issue protective gear for maintenance laborer number 4. My hands, once accustomed to signing multi-million-dollar contracts, shook as I gripped the cold wooden handle of a heavy steel snow shovel. Stepping out into the wide courtyard of the resort, where dim streetlights cast a faint glow over the thick crust of snow, I drove my first shovel deep into the frozen ground. A sharp, stinging pain shot straight from my blistered palms up into my shoulders, and every breath plumed into thick white clouds in the freezing air. There was no applause, no spotlight, just the scraping sound of metal against ice and the heavy thud of my own heart in my chest. Looking down at my swelling, bleeding hands, I finally understood a belated truth. To atone for sins born of greed, I couldn't buy absolution with money or hollow apologies, but had to pay the price drop by drop, with my own sweat, upon the very land my parents had bled to protect. 6 months had passed since the crystal chandeliers of the Grand Crystal Hall went dark, and the winter wind had returned to wrap its freezing arms around the Aspen Ridge Valley once again. But the estate no longer breathed the suffocating, toxic air of corporate greed, hollow ambition, and fragile promises. Today, Aspen Ridge operated under the quiet, steady rhythm of honesty, hard work, and genuine stewardship. Down in Denver, my youngest daughter, Nora, had packed up her corporate life and returned home to take her rightful place as the legal chief executive officer, standing shoulder to shoulder with me to protect the land our family had built from the soil up. Up in the federal courts, justice had moved with a cold, unyielding precision. Garrett Pute's sleek legal defenses had completely crumbled under the weight of digital forensics, witness testimonies, and unassailable land registries. Last month, a federal judge handed down a definitive 7-year prison sentence for corporate fraud, identity manipulation, and deliberate asset theft. The designer suits, the Italian leather shoes, and the slick, calculating smirk were all gone, replaced by a standard-issue orange jumpsuit behind the unforgiving steel bars of a federal penitentiary. The high-profile investors who had once cheered for him were nowhere to be found, having quietly severed all ties to erase their own complicity in the catastrophic wreckage of Meridian Corporation. Yet the most profound and striking transformation had taken place right here on the estate grounds, hidden away from the flashing cameras, media reports, and public gossip. It was a bitter December morning, the temperature plunging to a biting -15 degrees Celsius. Fresh white snow sat heavy and pristine across the sweeping timber roofs of the Alpine chalets, wrapping the entire valley in a breathless, frozen stillness. Inside the warm, familiar confines of the basement woodshop, the air carried its eternal, comforting scent, a rich blend of raw pine sap, boiled linseed oil, and wood smoke drifting from the cast-iron stove. I stood at my workbench, my hands wrapped comfortably around the grip of a traditional hand plane, carefully smoothing a fractured oak window frame that had weathered a century of mountain winters. Through the small, frost-rimed window of the workshop, looking out across the main cobblestone courtyard, the reality of human redemption played out in absolute silence, unscripted and raw. Out in the open air, braving the biting sub-zero wind, stood a man wearing a heavy, faded canvas utility coat and thick rubber work boots. His face was weathered, his hands raw and reddened from the biting cold, his breath pluming into thick white clouds against the gray winter sky. It was Derek. There were no custom Milanese tuxedos left, no expensive watches, no styled hair, and no haughty speeches delivered from elevated stages. The man who had once looked down from a brass podium to mock his own mother now clutched a heavy steel snow shovel, digging his boots deep into the frozen crust to clear the thick, heavy drifts blocking the main resort pathway. For 8 straight shifts, he worked without a single complaint, without a single shortcut, moving tons of snow under the heavy gaze of the mountain peaks. Sweat dripped down his forehead despite the freezing air as he labored in total, humbling silence. He had completed every single shift of his court-mandated and family-enforced probation without missing a minute, earning his daily wage through blistered hands and aching muscles rather than corporate handouts. When the sun finally began to dip behind the jagged ridge, painting the sky in pale shades of amber and bruised violet, Derek's shift finally came to an end. He dropped the heavy shovel by the tool shed, walked slowly across the frozen courtyard, and approached the basement woodshop. He did not open the heavy wooden door. He did not call out or ask for instant forgiveness. Instead, he reached into his pocket, pulled out a simple paper cup of black coffee, and set it down gently on the wooden exterior window ledge. He stood there for a brief, agonizing moment, his head bowed against the bitter wind, before turning around and walking away down the snowy path without looking back into the cold light. I stopped the rhythmic scraping of my handplane, stepping over to the window to watch his solitary figure disappear into the swirling winter mist. My fingers brushed against the warm paper cup he had left behind. I picked it up, feeling the faint heat radiating against my palms, and took a slow, deliberate sip. A quiet, profound peace settled deep into my bones, the kind of stillness that only comes when a storm has finally cleared and the ground has settled back into its true foundation. I knew as well as anyone that paper contracts and digital signatures can transfer ownership on a spreadsheet, but true dignity, true redemption could never be bought or inherited. It had to be carved out, day by bitter day, through honest sweat, unyielding accountability, and a heart humbled by the earth itself. Every piece of timber in this valley remembers the hands that shaped it, and every human soul eventually learns that nothing built on deception can ever withstand the weight of winter. The mountain keeps its own score, and today, the ledger is balanced, absolute, and eternal.
Before we say goodbye, I want to talk to you for just a moment. Wherever you are right now, What city are you sitting in? And what time is it on your clock as you watch this? Let me know in the comments below so I can see just how far this story traveled to reach you. More importantly, looking at this story, what is the biggest lesson you are taking away today? Is it about the strength to stand back up when everything is stripped away, the courage to walk away from toxic bonds, or the realization that human dignity and self-respect can never be bought with a price tag? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one, and I would love to know how this resonated with you. If this story touched your heart, please hit the like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss our next story. Thank you so much for watching. Stay strong, protect your peace, and I will see you in the next video.